I'm intrigued by the timing of your decision to go. I mean, you took this role on a couple of years ago. The Brexit referendum was 18 months ago. Why leave now?
Well, there were two reasons why I had to leave now. The first is that the EU withdrawal bill, which is the legislation that actually takes us out of the first stage of taking us out of the European Union, that comes to the House of Lords next month. Now, as your reporter rightly said earlier, I've been a vocal critic, but I'll be taking my criticism to a wholly new level when the bill arrives in the Lords and I become one of the leading opponents of it. And I just didn't think it was possible. I didn't think it was possible to combine fighting the EU withdrawal bill in the House of Lords whilst being a government advisor. But the second reason was, as you also reported, last month the government announced the bailout of Stagecoach and Virgin, the private sector operators of the East Coast Rail franchise. I believe that was a huge mistake. The government's been trying to silence me since then from criticising it, even though I'm an independent advisor, and I thought that position had become unsustainable too. So taking these two things together, I felt that I had no choice but to stand down.
The government that you've left are saying that you've jumped before you were pushed.
I don't know I have no idea whether they're proposing to dismiss me, but it would speak volumes about how they value independent advice if they were indeed proposing to dismiss me, because the whole point of the National Infrastructure Commission is it should be an independent body giving advice to the government without fear or favour. And one of the really depressing things about the government at the moment, which I think is unfortunately a reflection of the Brexit malaise which is sweeping Whitehall, is the government has become hypersensitive to any criticism. So anyone who criticises them on Brexit or anything else, even if they're supposedly independent advisers, they get attacked. So Michael Heseltine, who was on my commission, he got sacked from the commission, even though it's an independent commission, a few months ago because he opposed Brexit. And now you tell me they were thinking of dismissing me for expressing perfectly legitimate concerns about the bailout of two billionaire private companies on the East Coast Rail franchise. I think, unfortunately, it's a very sad reflection of the state of politics in this Brexit storm which we're now engaged in.
I mean, you're a Labour peer, but you were appointed to this role by a Conservative government. They've known forever that you are a very anti-Brexit, and you've been a very vocal Remainer. And as you say, the role that you have within the government is an independent role. Why couldn't you have carried on doing that independent role for the government while still standing up in the House of Lords and saying, I don't like Brexit, when discussing the withdrawal bill?
The truth is, I might have done if they hadn't tried to silence me. I was weighing it up and, in my mind before Christmas as to whether I could combine opposing the Brexit bill in the Lords with continuing to give independent advice on infrastructure issues. The critical issue that forced me to resign was when the government tried to silence my criticisms of the bailouts of the East Coast Rail franchise, because that goes to the heart of the independence of the National Infrastructure Commission. If I'm not free to give them my frank advice, after all, I'm a former Transport Secretary who had to deal with failing rail companies myself when I held the office that Chris Grayling now holds. If they not only devalue my advice but actually try to silence me as an independent advisor, at that point I think my utility has ended. I also think it puts a big question mark over the position of all independent advisors if they're subject to being suppressed or dismissed at the whim of a minister. The big problem with Brexit, which is what we're constantly now rubbing up against, is that it's going to make Britain worse off, not better off.
But you don't know that for sure.
Well,
the majority of people who voted
my strong view.
It's your strong view, but a lot of people will say, look, we haven't even left yet, and you're already writing it off. You accepted this job in charge of infrastructure, advising on infrastructure, already knowing that the government was committed to Brexit. Why would you do that if you were so at odds?
Actually, I launched the National Infrastructure Commission when David Cameron was Prime Minister, so it was before Brexit. I stayed in the job when Theresa May became Prime Minister. I'd hoped that Theresa May would adopt a sensible approach to Brexit. The right approach to have adopted was to stay within the customs union and the single market on which our jobs and trade depend. And to my great regret, what the Prime Minister chose to do instead was to ally with UKIP and wrench us out of everything to do with Europe's key economic institutions. And that is the root cause of the problem that we're facing at the moment.
Well, you say that she's pursuing a course that's fraught...
Brexit isn't being adopted.
You say she's pursuing a course fraught with danger, and you describe it as a populist and nationalist spasm. But how is staying in those structures, the customs union, the single market, how is that in any way really leaving the EU in the way that people who voted for Brexit mean?
Norway and Switzerland have very close relations with the European Union, including being a key part of the economic institutions of the European Union. Those institutions which the Prime Minister is now proposing to leave, it would have been perfectly compatible to have remained within the central economic and trading institutions of the EU, but to have left the political side of the Union. It's not ideal. The best thing to do is not to do Brexit at all, but it would have been possible. But unfortunately, the government hasn't adopted that course. But as I say, the issues which led to my resignation are much wider than that. What we're seeing at the moment is a Whitehall that's completely distracted from the normal business of government. It's been put to me
every
that
single department can't be.
If you take every department, there's a Brexit dimension of every department. Transport, the department I know well, which is crucially responsible for infrastructure, all of our aviation agreements across all of Europe, and indeed internationally, now have to be renegotiated in the course of the next 15 months before we leave the European Union. That is a colossal undertaking, and there's a whole load of other things that need to be done too.